Why does your child keep on having tantrums, regression, anxiety, agitation, no matter what dietary interventions you are completing? This video will help you, and you will uncover and discover some missing links that has to do with foods that you probably eat every day. They are in everything, they're everywhere. We're talking about glutamates, and you're going to hear from Dr. BARENDSE. She is one of the best bioindividual and nutrigenomic experts, and she's teaching inside of the Autism Turnaround course. In this video, which is part of a big Q&A in the Autism Turnaround course, she teaches you what you need to know right now about glutamates so that you don't stop the recovery or the turnaround process unknowingly because you don't know why it is that these foods ruin your child's ability to be calm, and what you can do to minimize the damage, what the link between glutamates and blood sugar is, and how low blood sugar can make everything worse, and the right and the wrong way to do the gluten-free diet in order to keep the peace in your home. Enjoy this video.
Elephant number 3. So I'm sorry we are running a little bit late there, but let me just quickly go through elephant number 3, and then we're going to talk about some questions and answers, take a few Q&As, maybe have a couple of minutes just for a toilet break before we do that. If there was one thing that has made a huge difference in my life with my children, with my patients, it's elephant number 3, excitotoxins. And here I want to just highlight, this is a short-term trigger. We're talking about those quick wins. If there's one thing you can do to get a quick win, please look at glutamate and GABA balance. So healthy brains need excitatory activity and they need inhibitory activity. So they need on and they need off in electrical circuitry terms. This is what drives our thought processes, it drives our neurology, it drives our movement, it drives everything. When a brain is always switched on, you are going to see massive behavioral differences. You're going to see anger, aggression, hyperactivity, tantrums. The spectrum of problems that you see will be different for each child, but underlying them is this issue that actually the brain has been stimulated without sufficient inhibition. And there are 2 primary neurotransmitters that are involved in that. There are others as well, but let's just highlight these 2, glutamate and GABA. And so glutamate is in our diets. In natural foods, some of our natural foods are actually really high in glutamates, and 2 of them are gluten and dairy, just coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally. But there are other things like, for example, broccoli. I know children who crave broccoli. Peas. I know children who crave peas. And some of us actually do not have genetically as good an ability to transfer glutamates into GABA. So when we eat extra glutamates in our diet, we're not able to keep that balance between calming and exciting neurotransmission. It's a huge issue. It's a huge issue not just for our children, but it's also a huge issue in my practice with adults who have mental health problems. I've seen massive reactions to relatively small amounts of glutamate, actually turning people's lives upside down. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that our brains, the brains of children on the spectrum, the brains of people with mental health challenges are on fire. They are inflamed. Their immune system has gone awry. And we'll talk more about this particular part, especially when we have a course a little bit later in the year about PANS and PANDAS. But for today, just let's concentrate on this one issue, that when a brain is overstimulated, it cannot be calm, and you will not see calm behavior. So on a day-to-day basis, my top tip for you today is to say, read and study this list. You'll notice that many of the things on this particular list also contain gluten or casein, and that's another bonus of having a child on a gluten-free, casein-free diet, but only when we're talking about using whole natural foods. If you go to the supermarket and you go to the food, the gluten-free or the free-from section, and you start reading labels, you'll find that the processed gluten-free foods and the processed dairy-free foods tend to be absolutely packed with glutamates and the casein, aspartates and other things like this. You'll also see that it tends to be there are significant amounts of these glutamates also in aged foods. And that's not just in the things that are aged in their manufacturing processes, but also when we take food like particularly meat, and we cure it, or we freeze it and then leave it, a couple of days in the fridge. There are many ways in which we tend to increase the histamine in food that creates more of a glutamate problems. We'll talk more about histamine next week as well. I think it's very important. And the last kind of thing that I'd really like to highlight is broths. Many of us have tried our children on diets which are using bone broth and other long cooked, slow cooked broths and soups and casseroles, etc., especially which have the bones in. And I have so many, not just parents, but also adults who've experienced this for themselves, that when they stopped using the broths that were cooked from a long, slow cook, actually they saw huge behavioral changes in their children. Perhaps one of my adult patients would really testify to this, because she had huge problems with migraines and had a lot of issues in being back to various practitioners and hospitals to try and understand what was going on. And when we eventually came to discuss her diet in detail and to work through this methodically, we found that her diet was actually periodically very high in some of these glutamate substances. And taking that out of the diet actually meant that she was free of her migraines. When she tried to put them back in, the migraines came back, and she did that experiment a couple of times. Go back to the observe, evaluate, plan, these cycles where you try something, you observe, and you see what happens. Don't just try it once, try it 2 or 3 times. And if it doesn't work, you know that you've given it a good trial. Maybe in 6 months' time, you want to try something again. But always actually give these observations a chance to work, and incorporate them more than one time. So there's a long list there. Become an avid reader of labels, and that's probably the number one thing that I could really help you, that I believe will help you actually to get to the bottom of these moods and tantrums and behavior issues with your child. Once you remove them, it becomes very clear when you put them back in that you'll see the changes, those unwanted things cropping up.
And also, I want you to just touch on the fact that grains can cause an issue as well with glutamates and the blood sugar, which we will get back into later on. But that, and I just want to say, be wary of candy, wine gums and stuff like that can have a really massive effect in my family, at least. But what is it about grains and blood sugar that can play into this, even though it might not be on this list?
So the big thing about grains, well, there's a couple of things. One is the immune profile that grains present to our body. So if our body reacts in an immunological way to a grain, it will be inflammatory, and anything that drives inflammation is also going to actually drive dysregulation of blood sugars. I want to go into the exact mechanisms of what's happening next week, because that's actually, I think you and I had a conversation about which order we were going to do these, and we decided to focus on gluten and dairy this week and move the blood sugar ones to next week. But I'm excited to share the blood sugar issues with you, because one other thing that I just want to go back to here that links today and next week with blood sugars is that when we eat glutamates, it actually increases the receptors in our brain. I'm sorry, when our blood sugar levels drop, it increases the brain receptors for glutamates. And so we've got this unbalancing happening from two perspectives, because not only does it happen in that direction, but also when we eat more glutamates, it causes a fall or a dysregulation in blood sugars. So it works both ways. So we've got the excitatory activity and the calming activity being unbalanced, and we've got the blood sugar levels, our insulin response, and our brain becoming actually more dysregulated in its levels of reactivity. When it comes to grains, also the one thing that I think is important to say is that grains that are unprocessed, one of the best ways that we can deal with grains and make sure that they have the least allergenic and the least inflammatory profile is to soak them and prepare them in much the way that old-fashioned preparations used to do. So, for example, the long, slow rise of a traditional bread making actually breaks down a lot of the proteins that are quite pro-inflammatory. Or if we soak corn, for example, with a little bit of lye, then it changes the profile of the grain. So in traditional cultures, you'll see that usually grains were prepared using some kind of soaking or fermenting, and that they make it much more tolerable.
I hope you enjoyed the video. It's part of a huge training session that Dr. BARENDSE is completing inside the Autism Turnaround Course, and you can read much more about that in the description below. Grab your free food list so that you might avoid all these glutamates in your child's diet. The link is below in the description or above this video, so you'll find it there. And go to barefootautismwarriors.com if you want to learn more about this. Yeah, thank you so much for watching, and see you soon.